At 80 years old, I gave away everything I owned. And the most surprising thing happened when I decided to let go of my last bit of living expenses. Albert Franklin stood at the entrance of his empty mansion, holding a single suitcase. Behind him, the echoes of a life once defined by wealth and power faded into silence. Albert Franklin stepped onto the cold pavement, the heavy wooden door of his former mansion closing behind him with a hollow thud. The echo lingered in the air, as if the walls themselves were mourning his departure. He tightened his grip on the single battered suitcase he carried, the only thing left from a life built on money and power. The street was quiet, unnervingly so. Gone were the voices of guests mingling at lavish parties, the clinking of crystal glasses, the distant hum of luxury cars pulling up to his driveway. Now, all Albert heard was the shuffling of his own worn shoes against the cracked sidewalk. People once rushed to greet him. Mr. Franklin, the man with the golden touch, the man who could turn a worthless plot of land into a skyscraper. Now, they passed by without a second glance. To them, he was just another old man, hunched over and trudging through the city like a ghost. Albert's mind drifted back to the night he made the decision to give it all away. He had been sitting alone in the mansion's grand dining hall, the enormous mahogany table stretching out before him like a vast, empty sea. No guests, no family, just silence. He had stared at the walls adorned with expensive art, pieces he barely remembered purchasing. The chandelier overhead glittered like 1,000 tiny stars, each one as cold and lifeless as the house itself. Albert couldn't remember the last time he had felt warmth in that room. The decision hadn't come suddenly. It had built up, piece by piece, year after year. After the accident, Albert had tried to bury himself in work, amassing more wealth, acquiring more properties, surrounding himself with people who said all the right things. But the truth was, they didn't care about him. They cared about what he could give them: investments, opportunities, money. And he had given freely, hoping to fill the void Grace and Daniel had left behind. Yet, every night, he returned to the same cold, empty mansion. The bed felt enormous without Grace beside him. The walls echoed with silence, each room a haunting reminder of a life that had once been full. The day he finally signed the papers was supposed to feel liberating. He had stood in his lawyer's office, staring at the documents that would legally transfer his assets to various charities. His lawyer had leaned forward, brows knitted together. "Albert," he had said, "are you absolutely sure about this? You're giving away everything, every last penny?" Albert had nodded. "What good is it? Money can't bring them back." The lawyer hesitated, tapping his pen against the desk. "But how will you live? Where will you go?" Albert forced a smile. "I'll figure it out." Now, walking through the city streets with nothing but a suitcase and memories, Albert felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The skyscrapers loomed overhead, shadows falling like jagged knives. He used to own some of those buildings. Now, he couldn't even afford a room for the night. His feet led him to a familiar place, a park bench where he and Grace used to sit and watch Daniel play. The bench was still there, but the paint was peeling, and the wood was splintered. Albert sat down, the suitcase resting at his feet. Children ran past him, their laughter a painful echo of Daniel's voice. Albert clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He had spent so many weekends in the office, closing deals and signing contracts, always promising he'd make it up to them. Always too busy to sit on that bench and just be a father. A mother passed by, holding her son's hand. The boy tugged at her sleeve, pointing at Albert. "Mommy, why is that man crying?" Albert wiped his face with the back of his hand, startled. He hadn't realized the tears had started to fall. The woman pulled her son away, her eyes avoiding Albert's. Albert stood up and started walking again. The wind picked up, whipping through his thin coat, chilling him to the bone. His fingers ached, stiff and numb. He pulled the coat tighter around him, feeling more exposed than ever. Ahead, a line had formed outside a soup kitchen. Men and women huddled together, shivering against the cold, their eyes hollow, their hands reaching out for anything warm. Albert hesitated. Was this who he had become? A man with nothing left, lining up for a meal he couldn't pay for. He swallowed the lump in his throat and moved on, his head down. Eventually, he found himself standing in front of a rundown apartment building. The bricks were crumbling, and the windows were smeared with grime. A flickering neon sign read "Rooms for rent, weekly rates." Albert stepped inside. The lobby was dark, the air thick with the stench of stale cigarettes and mildew. A tired-looking man sat behind the counter, his face illuminated by the dim glow of a tiny TV. "Looking for a room?" the man asked, without looking up. Albert nodded. "How much for a week?" $50, the man said, scratching his chin. Albert's heart sank. $50 was all he had left, the last of his savings after donating everything else. But he had no choice. He handed the man the crumpled bills, each one slipping from his fingers like the last remnants of a life he no longer owned. The man handed him a key without a word. Room 305 was a tiny box of a space, just big enough for a single bed, a chipped wooden chair, and a window that looked out onto the alley below. The walls were stained yellow, and the floor creaked under his weight. Albert set the suitcase down and sank onto the bed, the springs groaning beneath him. The room was silent, unbearably so. He pulled the coat tighter, trying to warm himself against the chill that seemed to seep through the walls. There were no photos on the walls, no familiar scents, no voices echoing through the halls. Just emptiness. And in that emptiness, Albert could feel the full weight of his decision pressing down on him. Heavy, cold, suffocating. He leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling. The cracks in the plaster formed shapes, like a map of all the roads he could have taken, all the choices he could have made differently. But now, all those roads led to the same place. A tiny, lifeless room with nothing but memories to keep him company. Albert closed his eyes, his chest tightening. Was this what freedom felt like? Or had he just exchanged one prison for another? Albert sat in the dimly lit room, the chill of the night seeping through the cracked window. The walls felt as if they were closing in on him, each inch pressing against his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. Outside, the sounds of the city echoed. Sirens, honking cars, distant shouts. A symphony of life that he no longer felt a part of. The bed creaked as he shifted, pulling the thin, tattered blanket tighter around his shoulders. The coldness of the room mirrored the emptiness inside him, a void he couldn't escape. The photograph of Grace and Daniel sat on the nightstand, propped against the base of the dusty lamp. Their smiling faces seemed to taunt him, a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. Albert's gaze fell to the suitcase lying open on the floor. Inside, a few pieces of clothing lay haphazardly, wrinkled and lifeless. Once, he had closets filled with tailored suits, silk ties, and leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. Now, all he had was a threadbare coat and a pair of shoes with soles worn thin. A loud crash echoed from the hallway outside, followed by the muffled sound of shouting. Albert's body tensed, his fists clenching instinctively. Voices rose, slurred and angry, followed by the sound of something heavy being thrown against the wall. Albert rose to his feet, his pulse quickening. He moved toward the door, pressing his ear against the wood. The shouting continued, punctuated by curses and the occasional sob. It was a man's voice, rough, desperate, and a woman's, softer, but just as broken. Albert stepped back, his hands shaking. The old Albert would have opened the door, demanded they keep it down. The old Albert would have thrown his weight around, reminding everyone in the building that he was a man to be respected. But that man was gone. Now, Albert was just another tenant in a crumbling apartment, another soul drowning in the dark. The shouting finally subsided, replaced by the low murmur of a television playing somewhere down the hall. Albert sat back on the bed, his head heavy with exhaustion. He hadn't eaten all day. His last meal was a cup of watery coffee from the cafe. His stomach growled, a sharp, painful reminder of just how far he had fallen. He closed his eyes, letting his head drop back against the wall. Memories flooded in, uninvited and relentless. He was sitting in a plush leather chair, the mahogany desk gleaming under the warm office lights. The room smelled of expensive cologne and imported cigars, the scent of power and success. Across from him sat a young couple, hands clasped together, eyes wide with desperation. "We can't lose our home, Mr. Franklin," the woman said, her voice trembling. "We have 2 kids. Nowhere else to go." Albert leaned back, his expression cold, detached. "Your payments are 3 months overdue. My hands are tied." The husband's jaw clenched. "Please, just give us another month. I swear, we'll have the money." Albert's gaze flicked to his watch. "I've already given you 3. The bank takes possession of the property on Friday." The woman began to cry, her shoulders shaking. The man pulled her close, his eyes burning holes through Albert. "You're ruining people's lives." Albert had only shrugged, reaching for the phone to call his assistant. "Security will escort you out." Albert's eyes snapped open, the memory dissipating like smoke. His breathing was heavy, chest tight. The man's words echoed in his mind. "You're ruining people's lives." How many times had he heard that? How many times had he ignored it? How many people had he cast aside, just like that couple, in the name of profit? The next morning, Albert awoke to the sound of voices outside his door. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, his back aching from the lumpy mattress. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and cigarettes. Albert stood and walked to the door, cracking it open just enough to peer outside. In the hallway, a group of tenants stood gathered around a man sprawled on the floor. His clothes were filthy, his face bruised and swollen. Next to him was a woman, her eyes red-rimmed, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. "Another fight," someone muttered. "Third time this week," another replied. Albert recognized the man. He was the one who had been shouting the night before. Now, he lay motionless, his chest barely rising and falling. Albert stepped back, closing the door quietly. The sight of the man lying there, beaten and broken, struck a nerve. He had seen that look before, in the mirror, in the eyes of those he had turned away, in the gaze of the couple he had evicted. For the first time in his life, Albert felt something he had never felt before: helplessness. When he had money, he could fix problems with a single call, a single check. Now, he had nothing to offer. That evening, Albert found himself wandering the streets, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. The air was cold, his breath visible in the dim light of the street lamps. The city had changed, or maybe it was him. Everywhere he looked, he saw reminders of the life he once had. The five-star restaurant where he used to dine with clients, now filled with people who wouldn't recognize him. The high-rise building bearing his name, the one he had financed with ruthless determination, now a looming shadow against the night sky. Albert's feet carried him to the cafe where he had first seen Jack. The place was nearly empty, a few scattered patrons nursing cups of coffee. Jack sat in the same booth, his eyes fixed on the table, fingers tracing invisible patterns on the chipped surface. Albert hesitated at the entrance, watching Jack. He looked older than before, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow, the weight of the world pressing down on him. Albert took a deep breath and walked inside. The bell above the door chimed, and Jack glanced up, his expression unreadable. Albert approached the booth, his heart pounding. "Mind if I sit?" Jack stared at him for a moment, then shrugged. "Suit yourself." Albert slid into the seat across from him, the tension thick between them. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence was heavy, oppressive. Albert opened his mouth to say something, an apology, an explanation, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Jack picked up his cup, swirling the coffee inside. "You know, I had a family once," he said, his voice low. "A wife, a little girl. We had a house, a life." Albert's throat tightened. "What happened?" Jack's gaze met Albert's, eyes dark and distant. "You happened." Albert flinched, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. "I was working security for your company," Jack continued. 10 years. Never missed a shift. And then one day, you cut half the staff to save money. I lost my job, my health insurance, my home. My wife couldn't handle it. She left, took my daughter with her." Albert swallowed, his hands trembling. "Jack, I didn't." Jack leaned forward, eyes burning. "You didn't what? You didn't care. You didn't notice? You didn't even remember my name." Albert's chest heaved, his breaths shallow. "I'm sorry." Jack leaned back, his expression hardening. "Yeah, well, sorry doesn't bring them back." Albert dropped his gaze to the table, the weight of his own guilt crushing him. For years, he had convinced himself he was just doing business. But now, sitting across from Jack, he saw the consequences of his choices. Not numbers, not profits, but real, broken lives. And the realization felt like a knife twisting in his gut. The apartment was cloaked in darkness, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. Albert sat hunched over on the edge of the bed, the old wooden chair pulled close to his knees. In his hand was a pen, its ink pooling onto the blank sheet of paper resting on the nightstand. He stared at the empty page, his mind swirling with words that refused to settle. How do you write a letter to someone who can no longer read it? How do you apologize to a son who will never hear the words? Albert's hand trembled as he brought the pen to the page. The ink bled slightly, forming a small, dark blotch in the center of the paper. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. He took a deep breath and began to write. "Dear Daniel, it's been so many years since I last spoke to you. Years since I last held you, kissed you goodnight, or heard you laugh. The silence has been deafening, but I can still hear your voice, echoing in my mind, as clear as if you were right here beside me. There's so much I never said, so much I never told you. I was always too busy, too distracted, too wrapped up in things that, looking back now, never really mattered. I missed your first home run, missed your school play, missed every little moment that I can never get back. And for what? Deals, contracts, meetings? How could I have thought those things were more important than you? I still remember the last time I saw you, that Saturday morning when your mother packed the picnic basket and asked me to come with you to the park. You stood by the door, your glove in one hand, a hopeful smile on your face. "Please, Dad," you said, but I said no. I said I was busy, said I'd join you later. I watched you walk away, holding your mother's hand, not knowing it would be the last time I'd see you both alive. When the phone rang that afternoon, I was in the middle of a meeting, sealing a deal worth millions. The voice on the other end said there had been an accident, said they were gone. I remember the way the world tilted, the way the air was sucked from my lungs. I remember running to the hospital, my tie still knotted, my shoes still polished, as if business still mattered in the face of death. I remember seeing you lying there, so still, so small. You looked like you were sleeping, Daniel. You looked like you'd wake up at any moment and say, "Dad, can we go to the park now?" But you didn't wake up. You never did. And I never got to say goodbye. I've spent years trying to outrun that day, trying to forget it, trying to drown it out with money, power, things that can never replace what I lost. But it never worked. The guilt stayed. The emptiness grew. And now, sitting here in this tiny room with nothing but a suitcase and memories, I realize that I gave away the only things that ever mattered. You and your mother. And no amount of money can bring you back. I don't know if you can hear me, Daniel. I don't know if there's a heaven or if you're watching over me. But if you are, I need you to know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I love you. I always have. And I always will. Love, Dad. Albert set the pen down, his chest heaving as if he had run a marathon. The paper was smeared with ink, small smudges where his tears had fallen. He lifted the letter and read over the words, each one cutting deeper than the last. He folded the letter carefully, pressing the creases flat with trembling hands. For a moment, he held it to his chest, eyes closed, breathing deeply. Then he slipped it into the envelope, but he didn't seal it. It was as though sealing it would mean finality, a final goodbye to the son he had failed. Albert stood up, pacing the small room. The walls felt like they were closing in, pressing against him from all sides. He could still hear Daniel's voice, that innocent, hopeful 8-year-old voice. "Please, Dad, just one game of catch." Albert squeezed his eyes shut, his fists clenched at his sides. The air was thick, suffocating. He couldn't breathe. He stumbled toward the window and shoved it open, the cold night air rushing in and stinging his skin. He leaned out, gulping in breaths of air. The city sprawled out beneath him, lights flickering like 1,000 tiny stars. Somewhere out there, people were living their lives. Fathers were playing catch with their sons. Mothers were tucking in their daughters. Families were together. Albert leaned his forehead against the cold glass, his breath fogging up the window. How many Saturdays had he missed? How many dinners had he skipped? How many "I love yous" had he left unsaid? The next morning, Albert woke to the sound of children laughing. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, the letter still clutched in his hand. Outside, in the alleyway below, a group of kids were playing. One boy, no older than Daniel had been, tossed a ball to another boy, his laughter echoing up to Albert's window. Albert watched them, his heart aching. He could see Daniel's face in each of those children, the innocence, the joy, the carefree spirit he had once had before Albert stole it from him. Albert stood up, tucking the letter into the drawer. He couldn't let go of it yet. He couldn't say goodbye. That afternoon, Albert wandered the streets aimlessly. His feet led him to a familiar park, the park where Grace and Daniel had been heading that day. The trees were taller now, the swings rusted, the benches worn. Albert sat down on one of those benches, the wood creaking beneath him. A father and son passed by, the boy tugging at his father's sleeve. "Dad, can we play catch?" The man smiled, pulling a baseball from his pocket. "Sure, kiddo." Albert watched as they moved to the open field, the father kneeling to show his son how to hold the ball, how to wind up, how to throw. The boy's laughter carried on the wind, mixing with the distant sounds of the city. Albert's hands tightened into fists. He could almost feel the weight of the baseball in his hand, could almost hear Daniel's voice. "Just one game, Dad. Please?" But there was no ball, no Daniel, no chance to go back and say yes. Albert buried his face in his hands, the sounds of the father and son playing catch filling the air, each throw and catch like a knife twisting deeper into his chest. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park. The father and son packed up, their voices fading into the distance. Albert remained on the bench, alone, the air growing colder. He reached into his coat pocket, fingers brushing against the rough edge of the envelope. The letter. It was still there, still waiting. Albert pulled it out, staring at the name he had written. Daniel. The ink dark and bold against the cream-colored paper. It was all he had left, the words he couldn't say when it mattered, the love he never expressed when he had the chance. Albert closed his eyes, the wind whipping through his thinning hair. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." But the wind carried his words away, scattering them across the park, leaving nothing behind but the empty echo of a father's regret. Albert's feet dragged against the cracked sidewalk as he made his way back to the apartment. The park, once filled with memories of a life he could never reclaim, now felt like a graveyard, a haunting reminder of everything he had lost. When he reached the building, he noticed a small crowd gathered near the entrance. People huddled together, their faces etched with concern. Albert pushed through, his eyes scanning the scene. Jack was there, lying on the cold concrete steps. Blood trickled from a cut above his eyebrow, his lips split and swollen. His eyes were half closed, glazed over with pain. Beside him, a man in a tattered coat clenched his fists, his knuckles red and raw. "What the hell happened?" Albert demanded, his voice trembling. The man sneered. "None of your business, old man." Jack groaned, trying to sit up, but his arms shook from the effort. Albert knelt beside him, gently placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. "Jack, can you hear me?" Jack's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused. Albert?" "It's me," Albert said, his jaw clenched. "What happened?" Jack swallowed, his throat bobbing painfully. "Didn't pay rent. He threw me out." Albert's heart sank. The man who had attacked Jack was the landlord, a scrawny, bitter man who had a reputation for roughing up tenants who couldn't make payments. Albert's fists clenched at his sides, rage boiling beneath his skin. "You should be ashamed," Albert snapped at the landlord. "You don't treat people like this." The landlord smirked, spitting on the ground. "People? You mean bums like him?" He hasn't paid in weeks. Not my problem. Albert opened his mouth to argue, but Jack's weak grip tightened on his sleeve. Let it go, Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. Not worth it. Albert swallowed his anger, his jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth ached. He wrapped Jack's arm around his shoulders and hauled him to his feet. Jack winced, his knees buckling, but Albert held firm. Together, they made their way inside, leaving the sneering landlord behind. Inside the tiny apartment, Albert gently lowered Jack onto the bed. Jack's face was pale, beads of sweat dotting his forehead. Albert rummaged through the bathroom cabinet, pulling out a rag and soaking it in cool water. Here, he said, pressing the cloth against Jack's forehead. Hold still. Jack winced, but didn't pull away. His eyes drifted to the ceiling, his breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. I don't know what to do anymore, Albert, Jack murmured. I'm tired, so damn tired. Albert's hands stilled, the rag clenched in his fist. Jack's words echoed his own unspoken thoughts, the exhaustion, the defeat, the emptiness. Jack, Albert said, his voice hoarse. You don't have to go through this alone. Jack's eyes met his, dull and lifeless. And what the hell am I supposed to do? Go back to that shelter? Beg for change? What's left for me? Albert swallowed, his throat tight. I don't know, but we can figure it out together. Jack snorted, a bitter, humorless sound. Together, you're just as lost as I am. Albert's chest tightened. Jack was right. He had nothing. No money, no influence, no power. But he had time. And he had a lifetime of knowledge that he had once wielded to crush men like Jack. Maybe now, he could use it to build them back up. The next morning, Albert woke to find Jack sitting at the small table, a cup of stale coffee cradled in his hands. The bruise above his eye had darkened to a sickly purple, and his lip was swollen. Albert sat down across from him, the chair creaking beneath his weight. Jack, he said, folding his hands. I've been thinking. Dangerous, Jack muttered, taking a sip of coffee. Albert forced a smile. Look, we're both at rock bottom. No money, no place to go, but we still have something. Jack raised an eyebrow. And what's that? Skills, Albert said, leaning forward. I used to run a business, a big one. I know how to negotiate, how to market, how to turn nothing into something. And you know how to work security, how to build things, how to fix things. Jack's expression darkened. That was years ago. No one's gonna hire a washed-up drunk like me. Albert shook his head. Forget about getting hired. Let's start something ourselves. Jack scoffed. With what? We don't have a penny between us. Albert's eyes lit up. But we do have junk. Jack frowned, glancing around the room. Junk. Albert stood up, his hands gesturing to the apartment. Look around. This whole neighborhood is full of stuff people throw away. Old furniture, broken appliances, scrap wood. We can collect it, fix it, and sell it. Jack stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. You're serious? Albert nodded. Dead serious. People pay good money for things they think are vintage or handmade. We can make this work. Jack leaned back, his gaze drifting to the window. And if it doesn't? Albert swallowed. Then at least we tried. At least we didn't just sit here and wait to die. That afternoon, Albert and Jack scoured the alleys behind the building, dragging out old crates, rusted chairs, and discarded wooden pallets. The work was grueling. Splinters lodged in their hands, sweat dripping down their faces, muscles aching from hours of lifting and hauling. But by evening, they had a small pile of potential merchandise stacked in the corner of the room. A few old chairs, a wooden crate, a coffee table missing a leg. Jack collapsed onto the floor, wiping his brow. Now what? Albert picked up a hammer, holding it up to the light. Now, we get to work. Days bled into nights, as Albert and Jack worked tirelessly. They sanded the wood until it was smooth, hammered nails into place, repainted surfaces with bright, bold colors. Albert taught Jack how to use a saw, how to measure and cut wood, how to turn an old crate into a bookshelf or a table. And as they worked, they talked. Jack told Albert about his daughter, how she used to love sitting on his lap while he read her bedtime stories, how she cried the day her mother took her away. Albert listened, nodding, the guilt gnawing at him. He couldn't bring back Jack's family, couldn't undo the damage he had caused. But he could help Jack build something new. One night, as they sanded the edges of a wooden chair, Jack looked over at Albert. "You really think this is going to work?" Albert wiped the sweat from his brow, his arms aching. "I don't know, but we have to try. What else do we have?" Jack nodded, his jaw set. "All right then, let's do it." The next morning, they carried the finished pieces down to the lot on 5th and Main, the same lot where Albert once broke ground on a skyscraper. Now, it was empty, abandoned, a forgotten corner of the city. They set up a makeshift stall, a few crates stacked into a table, the refurbished chairs arranged in a line, the coffee table propped up with cinder blocks. People walked by, glancing at the setup, some shaking their heads, others stopping to touch the newly painted surfaces. Albert stood tall, his hands calloused, his back aching, but his heart racing. For the first time in years, he felt alive. The morning sun cast a soft amber glow across the lot on 5th and Main. Albert stood beside the makeshift stall, his hands resting on the back of a freshly painted chair. The wood gleamed under the light, smooth, polished, and vibrant, a far cry from the cracked, discarded crate it once was. Jack stood nearby, arranging a row of small, handmade picture frames on a rickety wooden table. Each frame was unique, crafted from scraps of wood they had collected over the past few weeks. Some painted in bright, cheerful colors, others left raw and rustic. People passed by, some casting curious glances, others stopping to run their fingers over the polished surfaces. Albert watched them carefully, his heart pounding in his chest. Would anyone buy? Would they even care? A young woman with a toddler on her hip approached the table. The child's eyes lit up at the sight of the colorful frames, her small fingers reaching for one. "How much for this one?" the woman asked, holding up a frame painted in a soft shade of blue. Jack glanced at Albert, his jaw tight. This was their first potential sale. Albert forced a smile, his palms sweating. $5, he said, his voice steady. The woman hesitated, her gaze drifting to her daughter, then back to the frame. Finally, she reached into her purse, pulling out a crumpled $5 bill. "I'll take it," she said, handing the money to Albert. Albert accepted the cash, his heart thudding against his ribcage. It was just $5, but to him, it felt like a million. The woman walked away, her daughter clutching the frame tightly, eyes shining with delight. Jack released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "We did it," he said, his voice thick with disbelief. Albert nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, we did." As the day wore on, more people stopped by, some just to look, others to buy. An elderly man bought a small wooden bench, a young couple purchased a coffee table, and a teenage boy handed over a few dollars for a set of coasters Jack had carved from scrap wood. Every sale, no matter how small, felt like a victory. Each dollar was a testament to their efforts, to the hours spent sanding, painting, and building. By late afternoon, the lot was nearly empty. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the asphalt. Albert sat down on one of the remaining chairs, his body aching, but his heart light. Jack dropped down beside him, a small wad of cash clutched in his hand. "Not bad for a couple of washed-up nobodies," he said, a grin spreading across his bruised face. Albert chuckled, leaning back. "We're not nobodies, Jack. Not anymore." Jack's grin faded slightly, his gaze dropping to the ground. "You really think this is going to work? That we can keep this up?" Albert watched as a group of kids ran by, laughing and playing tag. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm actually doing something that matters." Over the next few weeks, the lot on 5th and Main became a gathering place. Word spread quickly. Two old men turning trash into treasure, building furniture from scraps, and giving second chances to things that had been thrown away. People started donating old wood, broken chairs, and discarded crates, some out of curiosity, others out of a genuine desire to help. Albert and Jack spent every waking hour working, sanding, sawing, painting, and hammering until their hands bled and their backs ached. The money trickled in slowly, just enough to cover rent and a few meals. But it wasn't about the money. It was about the work, the purpose, the sense of creation. For Jack, it was a chance to rebuild his life, to prove to himself that he was still capable, still useful. For Albert, it was a chance to atone, to give back, to pour all the love and time he had once withheld from Grace and Daniel into something tangible, something real. One evening, as they packed up for the day, a man approached the lot. He wore a crisp suit, his hair slicked back, eyes sharp and calculating. Albert recognized him instantly. Ryan Colby, one of his former protégés. "Albert Franklin," Ryan said, his lips curving into a smirk. "Well, isn't this a surprise?" Albert straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "Ryan," he said, his voice cool. "What brings you here?" Ryan's eyes scanned the makeshift stall, the wooden chairs, the painted crates. "I heard you were selling furniture now, from trash." Albert forced a smile. "Reclaimed wood, giving things a second chance." Ryan chuckled, a condescending sound. "Funny. You used to sell penthouses and skyscrapers. Now you're selling junk." Albert's jaw clenched, but he kept his expression calm. Everyone has to start somewhere. Ryan's gaze shifted to Jack, who stood a few feet away, his fists clenched. "You know," Ryan said, lowering his voice, "you could come work for me. I could use someone with your experience. Pays good, better than this." Albert shook his head. "I'm right where I need to be." Ryan scoffed, adjusting his cufflinks. "Suit yourself, but don't come crawling to me when this little charity project of yours falls apart." Albert said nothing, his eyes fixed on Ryan as he walked away. That night, Albert and Jack sat in the empty lot, a small fire crackling in a metal barrel they had salvaged. The flames flickered, casting shadows against the brick walls. Jack poked at the fire with a stick, his expression dark. "You could have gone with him, you know. He was offering you a way out." Albert shook his head, his gaze fixed on the flames. Out of what? This is the first thing I've done in years that feels real, that feels right. Jack was silent for a moment, his eyes reflecting the firelight. You gave up a lot, Albert, for this. Albert pulled the letter from his coat pocket, the letter he had written to Daniel, but never mailed. He stared at the envelope, running his thumb over Daniel's name. I gave up everything because I had nothing left to give, he said. But now, for the first time, I feel like I have something worth holding on to. Jack nodded, his jaw tight. So, what now? Albert smiled, slipping the letter back into his pocket. Now, we keep building. We keep trying, one piece at a time. A few weeks later, the lot was filled with people, families, children, elderly neighbors. The tables were covered with handmade wooden toys, picture frames, chairs, and benches, each one stamped with the logo they had designed. Second chances. Because everyone deserves one. Jack stood behind a table, his hands stained with paint, his smile wide and genuine. Albert watched as he handed a small wooden toy truck to a little boy, the child's eyes shining as he clutched the toy to his chest. Albert stepped back, his eyes scanning the crowd. The lot was alive with laughter and conversation, a sense of community that he hadn't felt in years. And then, he saw her. A little girl with dark curls and bright eyes, clutching her mother's hand. She looked just like Daniel had at that age, wide-eyed, innocent, full of wonder. Albert's heart tightened, but this time, it wasn't with regret. It was with hope. Because in that moment, surrounded by people who had once been forgotten, people who had been given a second chance, Albert Franklin, finally, felt like he was home. Months had passed since Albert and Jack opened Second Chances. The once abandoned lot was now a thriving hub of life, laughter, and possibility. The tables were lined with handmade furniture, each piece a symbol of redemption and resilience. People gathered not just to buy, but to connect, to share stories, to find comfort in the company of those who had been to the bottom and fought their way back up. Albert stood behind a newly crafted wooden counter, his hands resting on the polished surface. Jack was nearby, teaching a young boy how to sand a wooden frame. The boy's face was lit up with excitement, his small hands mimicking Jack's every move. Albert watched them, his heart swelling with a feeling he hadn't known in years. Pride. Not the kind born from wealth or power, but the kind that came from building something that mattered, from giving people a chance to rebuild what they had lost. A familiar face appeared in the crowd, the woman who had bought the blue picture frame on their first day. She held her daughter's hand, the little girl clutching the frame tightly, now filled with a family photo. She caught Albert's eye and smiled, nodding in silent gratitude. Albert nodded back, his eyes misty. In that moment, he understood that he hadn't just given away his money. He had given away his past, his guilt, his regrets. And in doing so, he had made room for something far more valuable: purpose, connection, and a second chance at life. Albert turned to Jack, his voice steady. Ready to get back to work? Jack grinned, lifting a hammer. Let's do it. And as the sun set over Second Chances, Albert Franklin felt like the richest man in the world.